Archaeology has a missing children problem. Here is a puzzle that took archaeologists most of a century to even notice. Dig up an ancient cemetery. Any of them, Roman, Iron Age, Neolithic, almost anywhere in the world. Count the skeletons and sort them by age at death. You will find adults. You will find plenty of adults, you'll find some older children, and you will find almost no babies. Now put that next to what we know about mortality in those societies. Before modern medicine, somewhere between a quarter and half of all children died before reaching 5. The first year alone killed a huge fraction. In demographic terms, infants are the single largest category of death in any pre-modern population. They should be the most common thing in the ground. Instead, they're nearly absent. For a long time, this was written off, and the explanation was mostly a shrug. Small bones don't survive. Case closed. That explanation is partly true and nowhere near sufficient, and unpicking why has produced one of the most quietly moving bodies of evidence in archaeology. Because the babies aren't missing. We were looking in the wrong place. They're under the houses. Let me build this properly, because the preservation argument does need dealing with first. It's real, it just doesn't finish the job. Infant bone genuinely is fragile. It's thin, it's porous, it's a much higher proportion of organic material to mineral than adult bone, and it hasn't fused. A newborn skeleton is something like 300 separate elements, many of them barely mineralized. In acidic soil, that dissolves. Small bones are also more easily scattered, missed by coarse excavation, or mistaken for animal remains by an excavator who isn't expecting them. All true, and you can test it because preservation conditions vary. In sites with excellent preservation, waterlogged or highly alkaline or very dry, where delicate adult remains survive beautifully, infants are still underrepresented in the cemetery. There's also a methods problem sitting on top of the preservation problem, and it's slightly embarrassing. For most of the history of the discipline, excavation was coarse. Trowel, bucket, spoil heap. If you are not sieving your soil through a fine mesh, a neonatal rib does not survive the journey to the fines tray. It goes onto the spoil heap with everything else. Fine sieving became routine relatively recently, and when sites get re-excavated with modern recovery methods, infant remains turn up in places earlier digs reported as empty. And there's a recognition problem underneath that. A newborn's long bone is a small, smooth, hollow tube. If you are not specifically trained to expect it, it looks like animal bone. There are documented cases of infant remains sitting misfiled in faunal assemblages for decades. So part of the answer is genuinely that we weren't very good at finding them. But you can control for all of it. Take sites excavated recently with fine sieving by teams with specialists on staff in soil that preserves delicate bone. The infants still aren't in the cemetery in the numbers the demography demands. So the bones can survive, and we now know how to find them. They're just not where the adults are. Now the good part. Across an enormous span of time and geography, infants were buried inside the domestic space, under the floor, under the threshold, beneath or beside the hearth, in the walls, in the yard immediately outside the door. At Çatalhöyük in Anatolia, 9,000 years old, the dead were placed beneath the platforms people slept on, inside the house, and infants are part of that. Roman sites across Italy and Britain produce infant burials tucked into the corners of buildings, under floors, in the foundations of walls, in and around domestic structures, rather than out in the cemetery with everyone else. There's a specific Roman practice worth naming because of how it looks. Infants were sometimes buried in amphorae, the large ceramic transport jars used for wine and oil. The jar is broken open, the child is placed inside, the jar is resealed and buried. Whole infant cemeteries of this type have been excavated. It reads at first like something casual, a container to hand. It isn't. It's a vessel, a sealed enclosure, deliberately chosen and deliberately closed. And in medieval and early modern Northern Europe, there's a practice with a name that tells you everything: Eve's drip burial. Children who died before baptism could not be buried in consecrated ground. So they were buried immediately outside the church wall, in the strip where rain ran off the roof, so that water which had run over the consecrated building would fall on the grave. Sit with the reasoning there. The rule said the child was outside, so they found the one line on the ground where the outside was as close to the inside as it was possible to be, and they put the child in it and let the roof do the rest. That is not indifference. That's someone negotiating with a system that has told them no. Now, I want to put a brake on this before it runs away, because there's a failure mode in this kind of archaeology, and it's worth seeing. When a site produces a concentration of infant burials, the interpretation is genuinely hard, and it's easy to reach for the most dramatic reading. A Roman villa in Britain produced something in the region of 97 infant burials in one location, and one widely publicized interpretation was that the building must have functioned as a brothel, with the infants the result of unwanted pregnancies. It's a vivid story. It's also not required by the evidence. If a household buries its infants under and around its own buildings as a matter of normal practice, which we know many did, then a structure occupied for 2 or 3 centuries will accumulate a large number of infant burials without anything unusual happening at all. Continuity of practice over a long occupation produces a pile of small graves. That's arithmetic, not scandal. And this cuts both ways, which is the honest part. There are societies in the ancient world where infant exposure was practiced and openly discussed in the written sources. That is real, and pretending otherwise would be its own distortion. The difficulty is that a skeleton very rarely tells you which it was. A newborn who died of the ordinary causes newborns died of, and a newborn who was not permitted to live can leave identical remains. So the careful version of the claim is this: burial location tells us where a society thought its infants belonged. It does not, on its own, tell us how they died. I'd rather give you the limit of what the evidence supports than a cleaner story than we've actually got. With that said, the pattern of care is not in serious doubt, and it points somewhere specific. Which brings me to the argument this evidence actually settles, because there was a long-running one. The old position, associated with the historian Philippe Ariès and widely repeated for decades, held roughly this: when child mortality is high, parents protect themselves by not investing emotionally. Grief at that frequency is unsurvivable, so societies adapt by treating young children as provisional, not fully persons yet. Don't get attached until they've made it. It's a tidy theory. It also has the ring of something invented by someone reasoning from an armchair about people they'd never met, and the material record does not support it. Look at what accompanies these burials. Infants buried with grave goods, small objects, feeding vessels, jewelry, amulets, occasionally items far more valuable than anything the household would casually give up. Bodies positioned with care, wrapped, oriented deliberately. Effort spent, and effort is the hard currency of archaeology because effort is expensive and you can measure it. Digging up a house floor to make a grave is work. Sealing an amphora is work. Carrying a body to the one strip of ground where the rain falls off a church roof is work. Then look at the written sources where we have them. Roman funerary inscriptions for very small children are frequently devastating, and they're specific. They name the child. They give the age to the day. They say what the parents lost. That's not the language of a society that hadn't decided whether the child counted. The theory was wrong. Frequency does not blunt grief. It just means more of it. And notice what the burial locations are actually telling us, because there's a pattern in them beyond simple affection. Adults go out. Adults are buried in the cemetery, which in most societies is a place set apart, outside the settlement, across a boundary in a zone belonging to the dead. Becoming an ancestor means leaving. Infants stay in. They go under the floor of the room where the family sleeps. Under the doorway, everyone steps across. Beside the hearth, which in most pre-modern houses is the literal center of the home. There are a few ways to read that, and they aren't exclusive. One is protective. The child was never fully out in the world and shouldn't be put out in it now. One is about incompleteness. A person who never took on a public identity doesn't get a public grave, because the cemetery is for people who had a social position to memorialize. And one is simply the obvious one, the one you don't need a theory for. They didn't want the child to be far away. The threshold burials are the ones that stay with me. A doorway is a boundary. It's the seam between inside and outside, and in a lot of cultures it carries protective weight. Burying a child there puts them exactly on the line, not out, not quite in, held at the edge of the house by the family that walks over that spot every day for the rest of their lives. So, let me pull this together. The missing children were never missing. They were in a category of evidence that the discipline wasn't looking at, because for a long time archaeology dug cemeteries when it wanted the dead and dug houses when it wanted the living, and nobody had quite absorbed that. For a large fraction of human history, those were the same building. The absence in the cemetery data produced a false picture, and the false picture flattered a theory that was already appealing for other reasons. That emotional distance was a rational adaptation to a brutal world, and that tenderness towards small children is a modern luxury we could afford once they stopped dying. The floors say otherwise. So do the amphorae and the grave goods and the strip of wet ground under the eaves. People have always done this. They put the smallest dead as close as they were physically able to, and when a rule stood in the way, they found the nearest legal inch and used it. The children were under the floor the whole time. We were digging in the wrong field.